So I've come to realize that what government is useful for is sort of forcing the will of a majority onto a minority, sort of forcing rules and regulations onto people that they wouldn't have accepted voluntarily. And the basis for this intervention was that the people in the government were not acting in their self-interest, that they had principles above themselves, and that they were going to act in the interest of the people they were governing. But how our society has developed, it has developed in such a way that that's not the case anymore. We have sort of, especially in the 80s with the sort of Reaganite, Milton Friedman sort of rhetoric, they tell you to worship self-interest. They tell you that greed is good. And in that way, if we're teaching those values to the entire population, even to the politicians, then how can we possibly expect them not to act in their self-interest? If everyone's been told their whole lives that that's what's best for society, then they're going to continue acting that way. And typically for an individual, that's perfectly a reasonable proposition because they are in it in voluntary market exchanges where they have no power of coercion. But when people in the government are only interested in their own power, then that is when the problems arise, because the way to power in politics is money and campaigning and advertising, and the people who can provide that for the people in government are the richest people, so those people will always have the most influence over government decisions. It's pretty clear that a lot of the regulations that we have, that our government has, aren't to protect the public for anything. It's just large special interest groups that are trying to consolidate the number of businesses that they're competing with. They're trying to reduce the amount of competition so that they don't have to work as hard. There was an example of haircutters in one of the states trying to force an African hair braiding business to have haircutting permits, and basically they were just trying to shut them down. And actually the Institute for Justice won that case for the hair braiders. They didn't have to get the permits, but the point is the regulations that pass seem to be so much more strongly influenced by the vested interests, the entrenched interests. And people say, well, that's a sort of necessary evil. There's going to be problems because we need some sort of regulation. But what they don't understand is there are private regulating companies, and the only difference with them is that they give them a product the seal of approval, and then they let the customer decide whether they still want to use the product or not. A sort of buyer beware, but we're not going to prevent the buyer from choosing to buy the products and live the way he wants. And one example of the private certification agencies, which I hadn't even really noticed until somebody brought it to my attention, is Underwriters Laboratories. Sometimes you might remember the sort of UL logo on the side of things. I still see it around. And that's just one example of how companies can sort of give products their seal of approval, and then the public can decide whether they want to use that product or not.